Yo, I'm Godin and I'm developing a game in solo. And this month I finally finished the main character of the game. And here's the results. I'm really happy with how it turned out. Compared to before, I think it's a real step up. In this recap, I'll show you all the steps I went through to model this character. It starts with the high res. The workflow is pretty simple here. For this character, I stayed entirely in Blender and did all the scripting using the basic tools. The multi-resolution modifier is useful because it lets you sculpt across multiple subdivision levels. Since the final character will be shaded with a cel shading material, I avoid pushing the detail too far to prevent unpleasant noise with toon shading. Typically, I don't want tiny folds in the clothing, skin pores or micro wrinkles. I make sure the surfaces stay clean without too much micro relief. Once the high res is done, I move on to retopology. This is probably my least favorite part of creating a character. Up until now, I've been modeling the character with maximum fidelity in mind, without worrying about the polygon count. At this stage, all that matters is smooth curves and well-defined details. But to get it into a game engine, you obviously have to limit the polygons if you want your game to run at a frame rate faster than a slideshow. That's when retopology comes in, and it's something I always dread a bit. Why? Because it's the point where I have to rebuild a mesh that sticks as closely as possible to the volume of my high-res. The high-res details will later be baked onto the geometry using a normal map, and every vertex position has to be carefully thought out to strike the right balance between density and volume definition. And it takes forever, almost as long as creating the high-res mesh. But it's not nearly as fun. So yeah, this is usually when I put a TV show or a YouTube video on a second monitor and power through the boredom. And after several days, here's the results. And the characters comes in at just under 70,000 triangles. For the fur around the hoods, I use Houdini and the hair grooming tools to generate a bunch of curls, which I could then brush into shape. The curls are then turned into tapered tubes. This makes it easy to create and edit the first shape. Before exporting, I merge everything into a single mesh to help with optimization, and I tweak the vertex normals to improve cel shading. It works pretty well, so I'll definitely reuse this method for the characters with fur in the future. As soon as the retopology was done, and before moving on to the UVs, I tackled the rigging and skinning. Rigging is the process of creating an internal structure of bones inside a character to make it move. Think of it like a wireframe figure inside the character. It's the wireframe that the animators manipulate to create movements. Skinning is the step where you assign vertices to bones so that they follow the bone properly when it moves. Very often, deforming a character reveals topology issues or areas that need improvement. For example, when bending the leg, you might realize you need a bit more vertex density around the knee. At this stage, there's a lot of back and forth between rigging and retopology, and that's why I do it before creating the UVs. When it comes to rigging, I am incorrigible. Once again, I decided to do it in Houdini. I usually do this in Blender, and I know that building a new workflow every time I start a character is risky. But the more I use Houdini, the more comfortable I feel with it, and more importantly, I see its potential for scaling a project, and that's incredibly valuable for a solo dev. So yes, rigging and skinning this character took me longer than it would have in Blender, but thanks to Houdini's procedural nature, I'll be able to reuse half the work for future characters. Houdini also gives me way more flexibility in this area. Skinning is often a bottleneck in the character creation pipeline. If the mesh topology changes after skinning, you usually have to redo the whole skinning step. But Houdini's procedural approach minimizes that problem. I can go back, move, add or delete vertices without losing my skinning data. Once the rigging is done, I immediately add physics in Unreal, always with the goal of making sure the rig is solid and the mesh is working properly before moving on. For that, I used a plugin that's popular in stylized Unreal games called Kawaii Physics. Don't let the name fool you, it's actually a very solid tool. The plugin simplifies the behavior of physical objects, making them less realistic, but more appealing in context of a stylized game. What I've noticed with this plugin is that the parts affected by the physics tend to return to their original shapes, the T-pose one, when there is no secondary motion acting on them. For example, a strand of hair model to point upward will stay pointing up when the character stops moving, instead of falling down due to gravity. This behavior results in a much more stable physics than Unreal's default solutions. From what I've tested, it reduces issues like mesh interpenetration. And on top of that, it reportedly performs better, so yeah, it's a win-win. Once all that's done, the rig is finalized and the mesh is validated, it's time to unwrap the UVs. Now, I know, usually I like to overcomplicate things with unnecessary fancy workflow or even force myself to use Houdini when it's not really needed. But not this time, I kept it simple, everything was done in Blender. No weird tools that generate UVs based on the silhouette of a crescent moon on Friday the 13th or something like that. The character has 6 different materials, each with its own UV sets: the head, the rest of the body, the hair, the eyes, the fake eye shadow, and the outline, which for now is just a copy of the geometry with flipped face normal. I won't go into too much details on that last one because I already know that I'm not going to keep this method. It's pretty expensive since it doubles the polygons, and I'm sure I can find a more efficient way to do it with a shader. Well, turns out I still managed to sneak a fancy workflow after all. After the UVs, it's time for the baking step, meaning transferring the high-res detail onto the low-res mesh by generating textures. Ambient occlusion, normal map, cavity map, height map, and so on. For this, I use Substance Painter, which has a pretty fast baker, especially when working with large 4K maps. Substance Painter lets you bake each object separately, then merge everything into one map. This helps avoid interpenetration issues, but for it to work correctly, everything needs to be well organized. Each object in the high-res must have the same name as its counterparts in the low-res, so Painter knows how to match them. To make my life easier, and because I'll never change, I made myself a tool in Houdini. Yeah, I guess I just couldn't stay away from Houdini for too long, eh? So, in Houdini, I feed in my low-res and high-res meshes, and for each object in the high-res, it finds the closest low-res counterpart and copies its name, saving me from having to do it manually. How long did it take me to make that tool? Admittedly, longer than it would have taken to just rename everything by hand. But for future characters, it'd be way faster. Assuming, of course, I don't decide to switch workflows again by then. And now we're hitting the slightly funkier part of my whole character's pipeline, the texturing. Since I'm going for cel shading, I don't need the typical maps like diffuse, roughness, normal, etc. At least not in the traditional way. Here has the maps I need for my shader. For color, it's actually 2 maps, one for the lit areas and one for the shaded areas. Why 2 colors maps instead of just one and multiplying it with the color parameter in the shader? Because to get it looking just right, I want full control over the colors. For example, the yellow of the jacket shifts slightly towards the red in shadow, while the turquoise moves away from green and leans more toward blue. With this setup, I can fine-tune the hue of every color in shadow, something you just can't do with a global shader parameter. It's a subtle effect, but I think the difference is noticeable enough to justify having a second map. Next, I use an ambient occlusion map, but not in the usual way. This one is used to modulate the threshold between lit and shaded areas. Basically, the darker it is in the AO map, the more the shadows will be pulled into that area. If I paint pure black, it's like painting permanent shadows, so the AO map in my project ends up looking like that. And then there's a roughness map, which controls the size of the specular highlights, and a highlight color map. Just like the shadow color, I prefer using a color map here rather than a simple multiplier in the shadow, again to have a complete control over the look. To get the cel shading look I want, I also had to manually paint all the line strokes. On every edge of the mesh I drew brush lines with some scribbles here and there to push the 2D feel. That took quite a bit of time, and if I'm being honest, I tried to automate it in Houdini, which I'm sure won't surprise anyone. I attempted to generate toon shading and bake it directly into the texture, but yeah, I couldn't get a satisfying result, and I guess sometimes I do give up on things. And lastly, I had to create all the textile details, the patterns, motifs and stickers. I did all that by hand in Krita, which has some really cool features for drawing infinite patterns easily. I was inspired by traditional clothing from Central Asia. I saw firsthand during my trip to Uzbekistan just how important textile patterns are in that region's culture, so I tried to bring that influence into my design. All of that makes up the general shading setup, but the head got a special treatment, which I already talked about in the last month recap, but I'm going to bring it up again because I like it. A basic cel-shaded face usually looks pretty awful. You often need to do some trickery to get it look good. Most people edit the vertex normals, but that workflow is demanding, requires a lot of topology tweaks, and isn't very flexible. So I explored another way. This time I hand-painted shadows directly onto the face for 4 different light angles. Each shadow mask is stored into a channel on a single RGBA texture, and in my shader I calculate the angle between the head orientation and the light direction, and dynamically switch to the appropriate shadow mask. I think the result looks great, and it's way easier to edit than a vertex normal based workflow. The downside, it only works with a single light source and only on one axis, but given the kind of game I'm making, mostly outdoor with the sun as the main light source, I think those are limitations I can live with. Am I overcomplicating things with another janky workflow? Yeah, maybe, but if you've made it this far into this video, you already know I love making things harder for myself. Anyway, after all that work, here's the final result. I finally have the main character of my game finished. It's a major milestone since she is the face of the game and will probably show up in most of the screenshots, thumbnails and promotional material from now on. Oh, and by the way, if you could wishlist the game on Steam, it would help me a ton and I'd be super grateful. With a demo planned for next year and the goal of reaching out for funding, I felt it was important to finalize the design of the main character now. And that's it for this month. The project is moving forward, and starting next month, I'll finally be getting back to gameplay. I'm planning to tackle the big chunk of gameplay for the guest house area, still working toward a playable demo. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to get updates on the Silk Road project, and I'll see you next month. Bye.